10,000 years ago, the land beneath your feet belonged to giants. There was the woolly mammoth, the saber-tooth, and sloths that were the size of minivans, which is way too big. But one predator stood out above all the others, not for its speed or stealth, but for its sheer bone-crushing power and its future iconic role in Game of Thrones. This was the direwolf, a real animal that once roamed the earth. It was bigger than a gray wolf, stronger, hungrier, and then it vanished. For thousands of years, it lived only in fossils and in fantasy, until now. This is the full story of how the direwolf lived, why it vanished, and how it came back. The direwolf didn't appear overnight. Instead, it was carved by time, the product of millions of years of evolution. And in fact, the direwolf did not rise from gray wolves, as many people expect, but instead came from a distant ancestor, one that split off over 5 million years ago. This was not just a wolf. It never was. It was something older, wilder, and eventually one of the most dominant predators the Ice Age would ever know. Imagine waking up to a world where everything is just a little bit bigger and colder, and suddenly everything is trying to eat you. The wind moves across low, open grasslands. Herds of ancient horses graze in the distance, their heads lifting at the slightest shift in the breeze. A giant sloth lumbers between the trees, and somewhere nearby, a mammoth bellows. Us humans were mere hunter-gatherers at this time, hunting giant animals for food, while also trying to not become food. And watching it all, quietly, from the edge of a hill, is the dire wolf, waiting for her moment to strike. She's not alone. In fact, she's never alone, because she moves with her pack, each one broad-shouldered and thick-furred, with strong jaws built for tackling prey much larger than themselves. Direwolf stood nearly 3 feet tall at the shoulders, standing on all fours, and weighed often over 150 pounds, which is as much as a full-grown human. Needless to say, they were larger and heavier than most modern gray wolves. Their skulls were broader too, their teeth were thicker, and their bite force was powerful enough to crack through bone like it was paper mache. They were highly specialized hunters when it came to megafauna, the big animals like mammoths, giant sloths, and horses and bison. They were not the fastest predators in the world, nor the most agile, but that didn't matter, because they didn't need to be. Instead, the direwolf relied on teamwork, strategy, and a well-timed, powerful strike. And they worked as a team all around the world. From sea level to mountains over 7,000 feet high, direwolves thrived across forests, deserts, grasslands, even deep into what's now Central and South America. While they originated in North America, they spread everywhere, making all kinds of different territory their own. For over 100,000 years, the direwolf reigned as one of the top predators of the Ice Age. There's a site known as the La Brea Tar Pits, and it is full of direwolf fossils. There, more than 4,000 direwolf fossils have been uncovered, which is more than any other predator at that site. And from this site, we can infer that the direwolf far outnumbered other predators like the saber-toothed cat and gray wolves. And this tells us something very important. The direwolf wasn't just some fringe species, struggling to survive and being amazing only in legend. No, it was a fierce predator in the Ice Age. Adaptable, social, and incredibly successful. But no species, no matter how powerful, lives forever. And unbeknownst to this dire wolf pack, the Ice Age was coming to an end. It didn't happen all at once. There was no great disaster, no meteor streaking through the sky, no massive volcanic eruption, just a quiet, slow unraveling. Scientists believe that as early as 30,000 to 20,000 years ago, Earth's climate began to shift, and the final collapse came more abruptly between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, and this is when the Ice Age drew to a close. By 11,000 years ago, the direwolf was gone, fading into legend. So, what happened? Why did it go extinct? Because it's not as simple as the world warmed up. It's more accurate to say the world changed. Temperatures did rise, rainfall patterns shifted, the dry seasons grew longer, glaciers retreated, grasslands dried and gave way to forests and wetlands. Entire ecosystems that had been stable for tens of thousands of years began to break apart because of this change in temperature. Some animals moved on to different places. Others couldn't cope with the change and vanished completely. And for the direwolf, the familiar rhythm of life was completely shattered. The animals that were hit the hardest by this climate changing were the big ones, the mammoths, the saber-tooths, and those were the ones that went extinct. And so for the direwolf, who relied on these massive animals for food, they were in trouble. Herds that once rumbled across the horizon, the mammoths, the bison, the horses, became harder to find. The hunts grew longer and less successful. The pack that once feasted on megafauna now had to roam farther, wait longer, and risk more just to get by. Direwolves were adaptable, as I said, thriving in grasslands, mountains, and deserts, but the problem was the animals that they hunted were not. Scientists call this period the quaternary megafaunal extinction, basically meaning that it was a time period where the big animals disappeared. Now, if you're like me, you might be thinking, well, that's fine. The direwolf doesn't need to eat the big animals. It can just eat the small ones, right? Well, not quite. The direwolf was a champion at a game that was no longer being played. It was not a jack of all trades, but instead a master of one. They were amazing hunters when it came to those big animals, but they were much less skilled at catching nimble deer or quick-footed rabbits. To the contrary, their cousins, the gray wolves and early coyotes, excelled at this task, and so these species likely kept the direwolf away from the last bit of food that remained. Some believe that early humans played a role in this mass extinction too. We can assume that the direwolf certainly tried, again and again, but the world had changed. What was left was a highly specialized hunter, standing at the edge of a world that it no longer recognized. So gradually, the paw prints thinned out, until at last, there were none at all. For thousands of years, the direwolf was gone. Extinct, it didn't exist anymore, like the dinosaurs. All we had left were fossils, scattered across the world, skulls, teeth, and bones thick with the echoes of an ancient world. Paleontologists studied them, artists reimagined them, and for generations the direwolf remained a ghost, a legend from a colder, wilder time. Until, 7 months ago. A company known as Colossal Biosciences began talking some pretty big talk. They claimed they could bring species back that were previously extinct. And at the head of all this was the direwolf. The news headlines exploded. The direwolf's howl was heard again after thousands of years of silence. Created using modern wolves as a base and editing key genes to recreate direwolf traits. Their names were Romulus and Remus. And then, in January 25, a third pup arrived, a female named Khaleesi. The 3 wolves are being raised in a sprawling private sanctuary, carefully monitored and kept far from public view. But even at a few months old, it was clear. These wolves may have come from gray wolves, but they were no ordinary wolf. Romulus and Remus were already 90 pounds by their half-birthday, nearly 25% larger than modern gray wolves of the same age. Their skulls were broader, their jaws more powerful, their coats thicker, just like their ancient Ice Age cousin, the direwolf. Of course, it's important to say that these aren't true direwolves, not in the pure sense. The definition of de-extincting species is a lot more liberal than you might think. Genetically, these are modified gray wolves. That means Colossal took the genome of a gray wolf, edited about 20 genes in there, and now, there you go. This brings up the question that if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and talks like a duck, is it a duck? A lot of people say no, some people say yes. But one thing is for certain. In form, function, and presence, these wolves are closer to the direwolf than anything we've seen in over 10,000 years. Now, as I'm sure you can guess, this all brings up a lot of questions. What's the point of all this? What is Colossal's endgame or biggest mission? And is it even ethical to bring back a lost species into the very world that drove it to extinction in the first place? Well, I've already made a whole video exploring these questions and more, so if you're interested, you can check that out right here. If you like this video, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below so that I can see you in the next one.